When Daniel got home from work that Thursday evening, I was already gone, and the only thing waiting for him on the kitchen island was a sealed envelope, a small USB drive, and the brass house key he thought I would never stop using. I didn't leave in a storm of shouting or broken dishes. I didn't slam the door. I didn't call his phone a dozen times demanding explanations. I simply folded the last of my sweaters into a suitcase, turned off the hallway light, and walked out of the house I had lived in for 38 years. 3 days earlier, I had still been setting the table for two, placing his plate at the same spot near the window that overlooks our maple tree, the one we planted when our son was 10. The house looked the same as it always had, cream walls, polished oak floors, the faint scent of lemon cleaner, but something underneath it had shifted, like a crack running quietly beneath the foundation. It started with a notification on the family laptop, the one Daniel insisted we both use for paying bills. I wasn't snooping. I was printing out our electric statement. His email was open, and a subject line caught my eye: transfer confirmation, final authorization. I remember staring at those words longer than necessary, telling myself to close the screen, to respect boundaries, to trust the man I had built a life with. But trust is a fragile thing when it has already been thinning for years. My hand moved before my heart could stop it. The message wasn't romantic or dramatic. It was practical. Cold. Attached were documents transferring partial ownership of our lake property and adjusting beneficiary information on 2 retirement accounts. My name had been replaced. Not by a stranger's, but by initials I recognized immediately: L.P. Lindsay Parker. His consultant. The woman he said was helping streamline his business now that he was too old to keep up with the tech side. I didn't feel rage. I didn't even feel tears. I felt something quieter. A settling. Like dust after furniture has been dragged across hardwood floors. Over the next 48 hours, I paid attention. I watched how he set his phone face down at dinner. I noticed how he stepped onto the back porch to take calls he once would have answered beside me. I listened to the careful tone he used when explaining why we should simplify things, and maybe consider downsizing, perhaps somewhere with less maintenance, maybe even an active senior community 30 miles away. He spoke gently, like a man suggesting a weekend getaway. But I could hear the math behind his kindness. That night, while he slept, I opened our filing cabinet and made copies of everything: deeds, account numbers, insurance policies. I called the attorney who had drafted our original will, the one Daniel hadn't bothered to replace because he assumed I would never question it. By the time Thursday morning arrived, I had already redirected my direct deposit, secured my portion of the savings, and signed a short-term lease on a 1-bedroom apartment 15 miles north, near a quiet lake where no one knew my married name. I cooked him eggs and toast before he left for work, just like I always did. He kissed my cheek absently, told me he might be late, and asked if I could look over some paperwork later. I smiled and said of course. After his car disappeared down the street, I washed the dishes, dried my hands carefully, and recorded a video message explaining exactly what I had seen and exactly why I would not be waiting when he returned. I placed the envelope, the USB, and the key in a straight line on the counter. Then I closed the door behind me without looking back. I was already halfway to the apartment when Daniel called for the first time. I watched his name light up my dashboard screen, steady and familiar, and I let it ring until it stopped on its own. By then, he had likely stepped inside the house, set his briefcase down, and noticed the silence. No television murmuring in the living room. No soft hum of the dishwasher. No lamp glowing near my reading chair. Just the echo of his own footsteps. I imagine he saw the envelope first. He was always drawn to anything placed precisely in the center of a surface. Order caught his attention. I pictured him loosening his tie, frowning slightly, telling himself that this was unnecessary drama, that I would be back by dinner. He would open the envelope before plugging in the USB. That was his nature. Paper first. Screens later. Inside, I had written in careful blue ink, the same way I used to write. Birthday cards to our son. I did not accuse him. I did not insult him. I listed facts. Dates. Account numbers. The confirmation of the property transfer. The change in beneficiaries. The consultation invoices addressed to Lindsay Parker. I told him I had printed everything. I told him our attorney had copies. I told him that I had protected my share legally and quietly. The second call came while I was waiting at a red light on Route 17. This time he left a voicemail. I did not listen to it. I already knew the tone it would carry. Controlled at first. Confused. Perhaps even wounded. Daniel prided himself on being the reasonable one, the steady one, the man who solved problems with calm explanations. But there are some explanations that collapse under their own weight. When I reached the apartment complex, the leasing manager handed me a small packet and a single silver key. The building overlooked a narrow stretch of water that reflected the late afternoon sun. It was not grand. It was not the house with the maple tree and the oak floors. But it was mine for the next 12 months, and that felt like oxygen after years of breathing carefully measured air. I carried my suitcase up one flight of stairs. 12 steps. I counted them without meaning to. Inside, the space was simple. White walls. Beige carpet. A kitchen no larger than 10 feet by 8 feet. I set my suitcase down and sat on the edge of the bed, letting the quiet settle around me. My phone buzzed again. A text this time. Where are you? Another followed. We need to talk about this like adults. I looked at the words and felt something unexpected. Not anger. Not triumph. Relief. For months, maybe years, I had been adjusting myself to fit the space he left for me. Speaking less. Asking fewer questions. Accepting vague answers about business dinners and weekend conferences. I had convinced myself that long marriages naturally grow quiet, that companionship sometimes shifts into parallel routines. But partnership does not quietly remove your name from documents while discussing retirement communities over coffee. I stood and walked to the window. The lake was calm, stretching about 200 yards across, with a wooden dock at the far end. A couple sat there, side by side, not speaking, simply watching the water. The simplicity of that image felt more honest than anything I had lived with recently. I turned my phone face down on the small kitchen counter. If he watched the video, he would understand that this was not impulsive. I had recorded it seated at our dining table, sunlight falling across the wood grain. I explained that trust once broken does not respond to apologies like a cracked dish glued back together. It holds, perhaps, but it never rings the same when tapped. I told him I was not disappearing to punish him. I was leaving to protect myself. Then I had pressed stop, saved the file, and walked out. The first night in the apartment felt unfamiliar, but not frightening. I unpacked slowly, placing my clothes into drawers that did not yet carry the scent of cedar or the faint trace of his cologne. I set my framed photograph of our son on the small dresser near the window, adjusting it until it stood straight. The silence here was different from the silence in my old house. There, it had been heavy, layered with unspoken questions and cautious conversations. Here, it was clean. When my phone vibrated again, I finally picked it up. There were 8 missed calls from Daniel and 3 voicemails. I listened to the last one. His voice was steady, but thinner than usual. He said that I was overreacting, that the property transfer was a temporary strategy suggested by a financial advisor, that he had planned to explain everything once the paperwork was finalized. He said Lindsay Parker was only assisting with business restructuring and that I had misunderstood the beneficiary changes. I placed the phone back down without responding. Overreacting is a word often used when someone does not want to admit that their actions have consequences. The next morning, I woke before sunrise out of habit. For decades, I had risen at 6 o'clock to prepare breakfast, to pack lunches, to move quietly through hallways so that everyone else could wake gently. I brewed a single cup of coffee and carried it to the window. The lake reflected pale pink light across the water. A thin layer of mist hovered just above the surface, drifting slowly toward the dock. I thought about the years that had led here. The gradual adjustments I had made without noticing. The way Daniel began referring to our finances as his investments. The way conversations about retirement shifted from we to I. I remembered the first time he mentioned simplifying ownership structures. He had spoken as if it were a favor to me, explaining that it would reduce tax complications. I had nodded, trusting him because that was what a wife of nearly 4 decades does. Trust is not loud. It is quiet and routine, like placing your name on a joint account without reading every line because you believe you are seen. Around mid-morning, my phone rang again. This time it was our son, Michael. His voice carried concern, not accusation. He said his father had called him in a panic, saying I had left without warning. I told Michael that there had been warning signs, only his father had ignored them. I did not share every detail. I did not speak badly of Daniel. I simply said that sometimes silence builds until it becomes departure. Michael grew quiet, and in that quiet I heard recognition. He said he had noticed tension during recent visits, that his father seemed distracted, that I seemed tired in a way that sleep could not fix. After we ended the call, I sat at the small kitchen table and reviewed the copies of documents in my folder. I traced my name where it still appeared and noted where it had been removed. There is something clarifying about seeing your absence in ink. Later that afternoon, Daniel sent a message that read, "We can fix this. Come home and we will talk." I read it twice. The word home no longer felt accurate. Home is not simply a structure with familiar furniture. It is a place where your presence is not quietly edited out of contracts. I typed a single sentence in response. I have nothing to fix. Then I set the phone aside and began arranging the books I had brought with me, creating order in a space that belonged entirely to me. On the third morning in the apartment, I woke to the sound of light rain tapping against the window. It was gentle, steady, the kind of rain that makes the world feel smaller and quieter. I wrapped a cardigan around my shoulders and stood barefoot on the cool carpet, watching the ripples form across the surface of the lake. 38 years of marriage does not disappear in 72 hours. It lingers in muscle memory. In the way I still reach to check the other side of the bed before remembering there was no one there. In the instinct to prepare 2 cups of coffee instead of 1. But grief and clarity can exist at the same time. As the rain continued, I allowed myself to revisit the early years with Daniel. We were not always distant. We had built that first house together, measuring walls with a borrowed tape measure, arguing gently over paint colors, laughing when the kitchen faucet sprayed us both because we installed it incorrectly. Back then, decisions were shared. Names were written side by side on every document. Over time, success changed the language between us. When his company began to grow, so did his need for control. Meetings multiplied. Titles expanded. And somewhere along the way, partnership became presentation. He would introduce me at events as the woman who kept everything together at home, as though the home had operated without strategy or sacrifice. I accepted it because I believed that loyalty meant patience. I thought seasons of imbalance would pass. But imbalance that continues unchallenged becomes design. I remembered the first mention of Lindsay Parker. He described her as efficient, sharp, someone who understood modern systems better than he did. I did not question it. I trusted that professionalism remained professional. What unsettled me later was not only the paperwork but the pattern. The subtle way he excluded me from conversations about assets. The sudden suggestion that perhaps I would be happier somewhere smaller, somewhere easier to manage, as if I were the fragile one. It is difficult to describe the moment when realization stops being suspicion and becomes certainty. It is not loud. It is a quiet alignment of details. A bank statement that does not match previous balances. A calendar entry labeled simply as off-site meeting repeated every Thursday afternoon. A hesitation in his voice when I asked about long-term plans. Standing in that small apartment kitchen, I realized something else as well. I had allowed comfort to become complacency. I had trusted habit more than evidence. That was not weakness. It was faith. But faith without transparency cannot survive. Around noon, my phone rang again. Daniel this time did not leave a message. Instead, a text arrived minutes later. He wrote that Lindsay had nothing to do with any personal matters and that the changes were temporary safeguards. He wrote that I had embarrassed him by involving an attorney. I read those words carefully. Embarrassment suggests public exposure. I had spoken to one lawyer, privately, to protect what was legally mine. If that felt like humiliation to him, then perhaps the problem was not my departure but his expectation that I would remain silent. I placed the phone down and opened my folder once more. The copies were clear. Dates were stamped. Signatures were visible. My absence in certain sections was deliberate, not accidental. I poured myself another cup of coffee and sat at the small table, listening to the rain soften. For the first time in years, my future felt uncertain but honest. And honesty, even when it arrives late, is steadier than comfort built on omission. By the end of that week, the rain had cleared and the air carried the crisp edge of early fall. I drove back to town on Saturday morning, not to return home, but to meet with the attorney in person. His office sat on the second floor of a brick building near Main Street, above a bakery that smelled faintly of cinnamon and warm bread. I had walked into that office decades earlier as a newly married woman, signing wills and insurance papers with a sense of shared purpose. This time, I entered alone. The attorney reviewed the copies I had brought and confirmed what I already understood. The transfers Daniel initiated were legal, but only within limits. As his spouse, I retained rights he could not quietly remove. He explained that attempting to reposition assets without disclosure during an active marriage could complicate matters if the situation escalated. I listened carefully, asking measured questions. I did not speak with bitterness. I spoke with precision. When I left the office, I felt steadier. Not triumphant. Not vindictive. Simply informed. Daniel sent another message that afternoon. He wrote that he had spoken to Lindsay and that she was upset by the implication that she had influenced personal decisions. He wrote that the beneficiary changes were temporary tax strategies and that reversing them would be simple. The simplicity he described felt convenient. Reversals require intention, and intention requires honesty at the start. I responded only once, asking him to provide written documentation explaining the purpose and timeline of every transfer. I requested transparency in numbers, not promises in tone. His reply did not arrive immediately. That silence told me more than his explanations had. On Sunday morning, I returned to the lake apartment and walked along the water for nearly a mile. The path circled the shoreline, bordered by low grass and scattered benches facing the horizon. I moved slowly, noticing how different it felt to make decisions without consulting anyone else. There was a strange lightness in that autonomy. For years, I had adjusted my schedule around his meetings, his travel, his deadlines. Now, the only clock I answered to was the one on my own wrist. Later that afternoon, Michael called again. His voice carried careful neutrality. He said his father had admitted to moving assets under advisement from someone at the firm, but had not anticipated that I would see the paperwork. I asked Michael a simple question. If you had planned something fair and transparent, would you hide it from your spouse? He did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, he said no. That single word settled between us like a quiet agreement. I did not ask him to choose sides. I did not need validation. I needed clarity. As evening approached, I opened my laptop and began organizing my finances independently. I reviewed my retirement accounts, adjusted beneficiary information where necessary, and ensured that every document reflected my current address. I created a new email account solely for legal correspondence. Each action was deliberate, small, and grounded in reality. Daniel sent one final message before midnight. He wrote that he missed me, that the house felt empty, that this was not how he imagined our later years unfolding. I read those words carefully. Emptiness can be felt in many rooms. I did not respond. Instead, I closed the laptop, turned off the light, and lay in the quiet apartment knowing that the future ahead of me, while uncertain, was no longer being written without my knowledge. Monday arrived with a thin layer of fog resting over the lake, and for the first time in years I did not feel the urge to check Daniel's schedule before planning my own day. I dressed simply, a navy sweater and gray slacks, and drove back toward town with a clear purpose. I had no intention of stepping inside the house yet. Instead, I stopped at the bank where we had held our primary accounts for nearly 3 decades. The building looked unchanged, the same polished counters and muted carpet, the same framed photographs of local landmarks along the walls. I requested a meeting with a senior account manager and presented my identification along with copies of the recent transfers. My voice remained calm as I explained that I wanted written confirmation of my current standing and documentation of any changes initiated within the past 6 months. The manager reviewed the records carefully and confirmed that while certain beneficiary adjustments had been processed, the core joint account still required dual authorization for full closure. Hearing that steadied something inside me. Daniel had attempted to reposition assets, but he had not fully dismantled our shared foundation. After leaving the bank, I drove slowly past our neighborhood without turning onto our street. The maple tree in the distance stood exactly as it always had, leaves beginning to tint red at the edges. I did not feel the pull to return. Instead, I headed back toward the apartment, windows slightly open, letting the cool air move through the car. Later that afternoon, Daniel called again. His tone had shifted. There was less insistence and more calculation. He said he had spoken to his financial advisor and that reversing certain changes would require paperwork. He asked if we could meet privately, just the two of us, to discuss next steps. I told him that any discussion would take place in the presence of counsel. Silence followed. He said that involving attorneys made everything adversarial. I replied that secrecy had made it necessary. After ending the call, I sat at the small kitchen table and opened my notebook. I began listing practical considerations. Housing. Healthcare. Long-term income. I calculated my projected monthly expenses, including the apartment rent, utilities, groceries, and insurance premiums. The numbers were manageable. I had contributed more to our financial stability than Daniel ever publicly acknowledged. I had managed investments, balanced accounts, and ensured that our retirement contributions were consistent. The narrative that I was dependent had always been convenient, not accurate. That evening, Michael called once more. He said his father seemed unsettled, that the house felt unfamiliar without my routines anchoring it. I listened quietly. Familiarity is not ownership. Routine is not loyalty. I asked Michael how he felt about transparency in his own marriage. He answered without hesitation that honesty was non-negotiable. I told him to hold on to that principle. When the call ended, I stepped outside onto the narrow balcony attached to my apartment. The lake reflected the last light of day in soft gold streaks stretching across nearly 200 yards of water. A gentle breeze moved through the trees along the shoreline. I realized then that Daniel had underestimated something fundamental. He believed that stability would keep me in place. He believed that years invested equaled years obligated. But stability built on incomplete truth is fragile. As night settled, I organized my documents into labeled folders and placed them neatly inside the drawer beside my bed. I turned off the lamp and lay back, aware that the coming weeks would require patience and resolve. For the first time, I did not feel like a woman reacting to betrayal. I felt like a woman preparing her own terms. 2 days later, Daniel agreed to meet at the attorney's office on Wednesday afternoon. I arrived 10 minutes early, carrying a slim leather folder and wearing the same navy sweater I had worn the morning I left. I chose it deliberately. Not as armor, but as a reminder that I was steady. The waiting room smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. When Daniel walked in, he looked tired. Not disheveled, not broken, simply unsettled. He nodded at me instead of attempting an embrace. That small restraint told me he understood the boundary I had drawn. We sat across from one another at the long conference table, the attorney positioned at the head. Daniel began by repeating that the transfers were strategic, temporary, designed to optimize tax exposure and protect assets from market volatility. He spoke clearly, almost professionally, as if presenting quarterly results. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I opened my folder and slid copies of the documents forward, highlighting the dates that coincided with his private Thursday meetings. I asked a simple question. If this was temporary and transparent, why was I not informed before the signatures were finalized? He hesitated. The attorney watched quietly. Daniel said he intended to explain everything once the restructuring was complete. I nodded slowly. Intent without disclosure is still concealment. The attorney then clarified that while some adjustments could be reversed, any future financial planning would require mutual written consent to avoid legal complications. Hearing that in a neutral voice shifted the room. Daniel was no longer speaking as the architect of our shared future. He was one party among two. The conversation moved to practical matters. Living arrangements. Access to accounts. Protection of joint property. I stated that I would remain in the apartment for the duration of my lease and that no additional asset transfers would occur without my review. Daniel agreed, though his agreement felt less like acceptance and more like recalibration. After the meeting ended, we walked out into the parking lot together. The afternoon sun was bright, casting long shadows across the pavement. He asked if we could talk privately. I agreed to stand beside our cars, nothing more. He said he never intended to replace me, that Lindsay was only a consultant, that his focus had been on securing our retirement. I looked at him carefully. Security does not require secrecy. Partnership does not require silence. I told him that rebuilding trust would require more than reversed paperwork. It would require transparency in tone and action. He asked if I planned to file for divorce. I answered honestly. I am planning to protect myself. The rest depends on whether you understand why I left. He exhaled slowly, as though recognizing that persuasion would not undo preparation. I drove back toward the lake without checking my rearview mirror. That evening, I walked along the shoreline again, nearly 1 mile, breathing in air that felt sharper and clearer than it had weeks before. The situation was not resolved. Reversals would take time. Conversations would continue. But something fundamental had changed. I was no longer reacting to decisions made around me. I was participating, with full awareness. As dusk settled, I returned to my apartment, turned on a single lamp, and placed the folder back into the drawer beside my bed. Control does not always arrive with raised voices. Sometimes it arrives quietly, when you realize you can stand in the same space as someone who underestimated you and speak without trembling. The days after the meeting did not erupt into drama. They unfolded quietly, almost predictably, as if both of us understood that the loudest moment had already passed. Daniel began sending detailed emails instead of brief texts. Spreadsheets attached. Explanations written in full sentences. He copied the attorney on certain correspondence, careful now, measured. I read everything slowly, not searching for traps but for consistency. Trust does not rebuild through emotion. It rebuilds through pattern. One afternoon, about a week after we met at the office, Daniel asked if I would come by the house to collect a few personal items I had left behind. He wrote that he would not be there. I considered the request for several hours before replying. Eventually, I agreed. I chose a Tuesday morning when the neighborhood would be quiet and the sunlight would make everything visible. When I turned onto our street, the maple tree stood taller than I remembered, leaves now fully red along the edges. The house looked unchanged from the outside. White siding. Blue shutters. The same brass mailbox with our last name engraved across it. I unlocked the front door with the spare key I had kept in my purse. The air inside carried the faint scent of polish and something else, something unfamiliar. Not another person. Just absence. A home that no longer hummed with routine. I walked through each room slowly, not touching anything at first. The living room sofa remained in its usual place. The dining table where I recorded my video stood polished and empty. In the kitchen, a single coffee mug rested beside the sink. One mug. Not two. I went upstairs and opened the closet. My dresses hung exactly as I had left them, though the space around them felt larger. I packed only what was mine. Jewelry given by my mother. A small wooden box containing letters from our early years. The quilt I had sewn when Michael left for college. I did not take shared furniture. I did not remove photographs from walls. I left the structure intact. Control does not require dismantling everything. Before leaving, I stood in the bedroom for a long moment. This was the room where we had whispered plans about retirement, about traveling across state lines in an old camper, about growing older side by side. Plans are fragile when only one person knows they have changed. I placed the spare key on the dresser and walked out without turning back. Later that evening, Daniel sent a message saying he noticed the quilt was gone. He wrote that the house felt emptier without my things. I read the sentence twice. The house had felt empty long before I removed anything. That was the difference. Emptiness is not measured by furniture. It is measured by honesty. In the following days, paperwork began to move. Reversals were filed. Beneficiary forms were amended. Statements arrived confirming adjustments. Each document was forwarded to me directly. There was no more secrecy in the mail. One evening, as I stood on the balcony watching the lake darken under a violet sky, I realized something had shifted again. I was no longer waiting to see if Daniel would correct himself. I was observing whether his actions aligned with his words. That distinction mattered. Forgiveness, if it comes, must rest on evidence, not apology. The breeze moved gently across the water, carrying the cool scent of autumn. I wrapped my sweater tighter and allowed myself a steady breath. Whether this marriage would continue or end had not yet been decided. But one thing was clear. I would never again allow my name to disappear quietly from the story of my own life. By the time October settled fully over the lake, the air had turned crisp enough to require a heavier coat in the evenings. The trees lining the shoreline burned in shades of red and gold, their reflections stretching across nearly 200 yards of water like a quiet painting that changed a little each day. The paperwork Daniel promised had arrived, slowly but consistently. Updated beneficiary confirmations. Revised ownership filings. Clear statements with both of our names restored where they legally belonged. He did not argue the corrections. He did not attempt another quiet maneuver. That alone told me he finally understood the boundary I had drawn. We met once more, this time at a small coffee shop halfway between the house and my apartment. The place smelled of roasted beans and cinnamon, warm and ordinary. We sat across from each other at a small wooden table near the window. There were no raised voices. No dramatic accusations. Only two people facing the truth of what had almost unraveled. Daniel admitted that he had been thinking in terms of control rather than partnership. He said he feared losing influence as he grew older, feared becoming irrelevant in a company that moved faster each year. He said shifting assets had felt like securing power. I listened carefully. Fear explains behavior. It does not excuse secrecy. I told him that marriage is not a hierarchy to defend. It is a structure to maintain. Together. If one person begins quietly relocating pieces of that structure, the foundation weakens for both. He nodded slowly, not in defeat, but in recognition. We did not decide everything that afternoon. We did not make grand promises about renewal. Instead, we agreed on something simpler and stronger. Full financial transparency moving forward. Joint review of any major decision. And space. Real space, not distance born of avoidance, but intentional time to determine whether trust could grow again in soil that had been disturbed. That evening, I returned to the apartment as the sun lowered behind the trees. The lake carried a calm surface, broken only by small ripples near the dock. I stood on the balcony, hands wrapped around a mug of tea, and allowed myself a steady breath. I had not left to destroy anything. I had left to remind both of us that I was not invisible. Stability is not proven by endurance alone. It is proven by mutual respect. My lease still had several months remaining. I chose to keep it. Not as an escape, but as a statement that I would not collapse back into routine simply because paperwork had been corrected. Daniel understood that now. When he called later that night, his tone was different. Not persuasive. Not defensive. Simply present. We spoke about ordinary things. The maple tree shedding leaves. Michael planning a visit next month. The first frost predicted within the week. Conversation without strategy feels lighter. As I ended the call, I looked around the apartment. The white walls no longer felt temporary. They felt intentional. Whether I eventually returned to the house or chose a different path entirely would depend on one truth that no document alone could guarantee. Transparency must remain consistent, not reactive. I set my empty mug on the counter and turned off the light. In the quiet that followed, I understood something clearly. The moment I walked out and left that envelope, that video, and that key, I did not lose my marriage. I reclaimed my position within it. And whatever happens next will unfold with my name written plainly, not quietly erased.